This week on Quadriga, Hungary, goodbye to democracy. Viktor Orban denies Hungary's dumping democracy for dictatorship by passing laws reigning in the central bank, judges, and the media. Laws that have provoked massive protest abroad as well as at home. The U.S. says Hungary needs to respect democratic principles. And the European Union Commission has opened legal proceedings for violation of EU treaties. Now Orban says he's willing to change some details of the new laws, but critics say the revisions are purely cosmetic. Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Is Hungary on its way to becoming Orbanistan, as some of those critics claim? And are Hungary's problems symptomatic of a larger malaise in Eastern Europe? Those are some of the questions we want to talk about today on Quadriga with a group of journalists who've been following the story closely.
Joining Melinda in the studio, Edith Enotai is based in Budapest and heads the foreign desk at the Hungarian newspaper Népszabadság. Kai Olaf Lang is an expert on EU integration and Eastern Europe at the Berlin-based German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Erich Kirschbaum is based in Berlin and writes for the news agency Reuters.
Edith Enotai, the revered Hungarian writer Georgi Konrad says that your country, Hungary, not only has a junk credit rating, it's on its way to becoming a junk country. Would you agree?
Well, he's a writer, of course, so he can allow himself very strong words. But I think more or less he's right, yes. Because all those rights which we were fighting for 20 years ago seem to not to matter for this new government which we are having. And it's funny to see that lately there were big demonstrations in the streets. This is probably the first or the second instance that people really recognize that democratic values are important.
Tell us a bit more about these new laws, about the new basic law and what kind of changes it's trying to put in place.
The Orban government has introduced or passed a new constitution. They never said it before that they want to change the constitution. Orban said before the previous elections that he respects the constitution, but then he decided to change it because then he can cement his power, absolutely. So I think the Constitution, we can argue about certain paragraphs of the Constitution, whether they are legal or democratic or not, but the problem is with the overall image, the spirit of democracy which this government represents.
Kai Olaf Lang, is all the alarm over Hungary and over perhaps its loss of democracy a bit exaggerated? We are hearing now from Viktor Orban that he's prepared to make some changes to the laws in question. He's saying they're going to roll back on several of the issues that have provoked protest in the EU. So are we perhaps making a bit too much of a tempest here out of this minor storm?
Yeah, I think the basic question is, where is this all heading? And is Hungary heading towards some sort of an authoritarian regime or a dictatorship? I don't think so. I think Hungary still is a democracy, but it's not any longer a consensus-based liberal democracy. It's somewhere in a gray zone between traditional Western-type inclusive democracy and an authoritarian thing. I would call it a majoritarian democracy. Viktor Orban and his followers say, we have won a landslide victory in 2010. We have a two-thirds majority in parliament, and that's why we're entitled to do a revolution, a conservative revolution. And we need this because something like a rupture, a break, is necessary, since the predecessors, the socialists, they have kind of completely destroyed the country in economic terms and in the terms of the functioning of the state. So I think what Viktor Orban wants is a new Hungary, and he wants to transform the country fundamentally. And aiming for this, he does a politics of power concentration. I think we should differentiate between things which are not nice and which we don't like, and things which are unacceptable. There are many things which are not nice, like the electoral law, which certainly is tailor-made for Fidesz, Orban's party. But this is something which also happens in other democratic states, that governing parties try to use the toolbox in this respect. There are other things which are worrying. For example, taking away core competencies from the Constitutional Court.
Also, the central bank, of course, there's an attempt here to merge the central bank with the main regulatory authority. But that's exactly where Viktor Orban is now saying he would back down. Eric Kirschbaum. Reuters, however, your news agency, was sounding pretty skeptical today, saying possibly this is simply cosmetic, what Orban is offering in the way of conciliation, and that in fact Parliament may not go along.
Well, you're right. It was a strategic retreat that he did in Brussels or in Strasbourg, but there are some scary elements of it. The central bank things are scary. The oath that the central bankers have to take before the parliament, the steps on the judges, trying to reduce the retirement age for judges to get rid of 270 judges overnight. These things are scary to people outside of Hungary and Europe. They're just unacceptable. The judiciary is supposed to be independent. He may have this 2/3 majority, but there's some pretty heavy-handed steps there that just don't fit in with the European traditions.
Kai Olaf Lang says Hungary is still a democracy, and perhaps some of the concern is exaggerated. Would you agree, or is that democracy on its way to being completely undermined?
I think it's still a democracy, but an autocratic, authoritarian democracy, which does not allow debate, does not allow criticism.
How is it for you in the media? What kind of pressure do people in the media face?
We have to differentiate here, because I work for a written newspaper. This is a private newspaper, and the media law does not really affect us. I mean, in certain little tiny bits, yes, but overall, no. I mean, there is no censorship. I know, though, that some of my colleagues who work for the Innen section, so the domestic section, have to be more careful than before when wording a story. But the problem at our newspaper is basically financial, that all the state advertisements were taken off. And we also heard from companies which are presently advertising in our newspaper that they are pressured to advertise also in loyal media to fit us. But the overall problem, or the big problem, is with the public media, which is clearly controlled by the government. And there were cases of falsifying news items, falsifying information, and that's, I think, serious.
Kai Olaf Lang, how would you describe Orban's appeal? Is it populism? Is this a form of nationalism? Where is this coming from?
I think it's kind of the idea of a national conservative, a neo-traditionalist renewal of Hungary. I mean, he's in many respects quite right in his diagnosis. What has been going wrong in Hungary? When, at the beginning of the 1990s, Hungary was the role model for transformation. Now then it has become the sick man at the Danube. In economic terms, because no doubt that the Gyurcsány governments, the socialist predecessors, they have caused serious economic and financial imbalance, and they were involved in mega scandals in terms of corruption and so on. So I think he knows that something has to be done. However, this is done in order to in a way which does not accept the necessity to involve minorities. So the way the constitution was passed, of course the Orban government said the opposition parties are invited to take part in it, but it was in a very rapid procedure that this new law was pushed through. And with a 2/3 majority, he says, I am legitimated to do all these major chances. So this is a bit also the predicament for Viktor Orban. He wants to be the man who unites Hungary, who unites the Hungarian nation inside and also outside. Outside. But at the same time, he's the man who polarizes and subdivides Hungary.
The interesting thing is that Viktor Orban was by no means always the politician we see today. Let's take a quick look at a politician who's adept at reinventing himself.
As a young man, Viktor Orban made his reputation as a dissident, a courageous rebel against the communist regime. Soon after the fall of the Iron Curtain, he entered Parliament as a free market conservative. Charismatic and dynamic, he was viewed by many in Europe as one of Hungary's most promising politicians. Elected Prime Minister in 1998, he fiercely promoted EU integration. His second term in office began in 2010 with a dramatic change in court. Armed with a two-thirds majority in Parliament, Orban began taking up the fight against what he terms socialism. He has packed the judiciary and media with conservative allies. The result, say critics, is creeping authoritarianism. One Green Party EU parliamentarian says Orban is the European Hugo Chavez.
Eric Hirschbaum, EU politicians like the one we just saw there, Danny Cohn-Bendit, are calling for sharp EU action against Hungary. Now, in the past year, we've seen how limited the EU's tools are when it comes to the economic implosion of a member country. What about political implosion? Does the EU have the tools it needs to exert pressure on Hungary and keep it on a democratic course?
Well, it is tough to do much once a country's in the EU. Before a country comes to the EU, then they can do a lot more scrutiny. But once a country's in the EU, it's harder. But there is Article 7, which was introduced in 2000 after Austria had the far right in the government. And that could suspend the voting rights of Hungary, and that's something that's in the air right now. That's something that's the club that the EU does have to use if the steps aren't taken that the EU wants from Hungary.
Well, the question is whether the EU is really willing to take that step, and I have doubts. I mean, in the European Parliament, the People's Party still has a majority, and Fidesz belongs to this party, and I don't see any signals from this party that they would distance themselves from Fidesz. And it's another question whether the European Council then, so the countries in Europe or the governments are willing to take this step and risk to introduce Article 7. This would be the first time.
Some people say, of course, that the Article 7 process alone is so shaming and so disturbing that Hungary theoretically might be shaken enough to roll back the changes. How are people in Hungary reacting to the discussion?
I'm afraid that this can backfire, because Orban argues that now the whole world is against Hungary. So everybody who is criticizing Hungary is basically against Hungary and strengthening the extreme right. I mean, this is a very shrewd argumentation from the Fidesz party. Right now, everybody who is critical is working for the extreme right. So that's very typical.
Which burned an EU flag some days ago in front of the building of the European Commission.
Kairo Leflang, what do you think about, you're an expert, of course, on EU integration and on the tools available to the EU. What do you think about this Article 7 procedure? Is it meaningful? Could it produce concrete and constructive results?
I think at the moment it's counterproductive for two reasons. First, I think it might spark a rallying around Orban, and he will emphasize his EU criticism. And on the other hand, if the Article 7 procedure will not succeed within the Parliament because the Conservatives in the European People's Party will not back that, then Orban can argue, look, even there in the European Parliament there is no majority criticizing us, so things are not as bad. The basic problem is that the EU in its toolbox has this kind of nuclear bomb. Article 7 is really a heavy weapon.
Taking away rights from a member country.
Right. On the other hand, it has, and that's what the Commission now does, it has the possibility to initiate so-called infringement procedures if the laws of a member state are not in line with the acquis communautaire, with the EU legal framework. And that's basically what Viktor Orban tries to do. He tries to channel it and to do, this is a technical procedure where the Commission checks if Article X, Article Y are in line. And Viktor Orban had a major success with the so-called media law. When he isolated, when he said, I'm ready to discuss, and when in the dialogue with the Commission, 4 points were isolated, and Viktor Orban changed it, kind of not changing the substance of the law, but having a certified Hungarian media law, and Orban could say, look, even the European Commission has given green light for that. And that's why now Viktor Orban in the European Parliament, among other things, said, I am ready for a dialogue, and if it's necessary, we will change. So he tries to avoid a politicization, wants to do a technical and bureaucratic process.
Eric Hirschman, what about economic levers that the EU could use via Hungary? Hungary is in bad economic trouble, very weak economy, badly needs money from outside. Does the EU not have some tools there that it could use?
Exactly. The EU and the IMF have some pretty big tools, and those tools have worked so far to get Hungary to make some steps that they've been calling for. Hungary was the first EU country that needed an IMF bailout in 2008, I believe. And we've seen Orban changing course a couple of times now as far as the IMF goes. So that's a very important step. The currency goes up and down. It hit an all-time low, I think, just a few weeks ago, as investors saw that Hungary wasn't being very cooperative and isolating itself. So the financial market pressures are probably going to be quicker and more effective than anything the EU can come up with.
Edith, to what degree is the situation in Hungary a product of economic distress?
Well, the people are concerned. I mean, when you talk to normal Hungarian people, they ask you what to do with their money, whether they should convert it into euros or dollars and take it out to Austrian banks. In the beginning of January, there was a wave of people taking out their money because they think that the country is going to be bankrupt. I don't think this will happen. I mean, Orban is clever enough not to let it happen because that would be the end of his rule in Hungary. That's for sure. So I think we will wait. In March, April, we can have a new agreement with the IMF, and then Orban will claim that everything is in order. Then things can go on, and perhaps he will restructure a bit his economic policy, but I don't think this would affect his democratic principles.
I think that there is one problem, of course. Orban always said, I have an unorthodox economic policy.
As the economic minister who always said that.
And if the EU and the IMF give green light for the standby credits, this will mean that this economic policy is going to be more orthodox, which means austerity, austerity, austerity. And then he is going to have a rising problem on the domestic political front, because there will be social protests and so on. As for the economy, Arpad Göncz, the former liberal president of Hungary, once said, people in Hungary and other Eastern European countries wanted democracy, but they got capitalism. And I think what he wanted to tell is that they got a quite wild form of capitalism. And this is, of course, also the driver of Orban's success and the downfall of Hungary from the most dynamic country in the region to a problematic case is also quite characteristic. I was a couple of days ago, when I was in Budapest, I went to the Hungarian-Slovak border. When I was there for the last time 3 years ago, hundreds of Hungarians went to Slovakia for shopping tours. Now there was basically no one, and Slovaks go to Hungary because they have the euro and because of the economic crisis.
Interestingly enough, Slovaks themselves seem poised to elect a populist, nationalist leader. And we've seen disturbances and street violence in other Eastern European countries as well. Hungary's problems are by no means Hungary's alone, but are symptomatic of a malaise across the region.
Eastern European economies remain the weakest in the EU, and the financial crisis has hit the region harder than any other. Poverty and unemployment have fed rising skepticism about European integration, and the past year's discussion about bailouts for southern European countries has only exacerbated the Eastern Europeans' frustration. In Slovakia, one government has already fallen over the issue. Nationalism is on the rise. Minorities are facing more frequent and vicious attacks. And neo-fascist groups such as the Hungarian Guard are finding it easy to muster new recruits.
Edith Inotai, no country is more aware of the dangerous link between economic distress and reactionary right-wing violence than, of course, the one we're sitting in right here, Germany. Is there a danger like that in Eastern Europe?
Well, I think Hungary is a special case. I think the thing is a bit more complicated than it was shown in this little footage. In other countries, I think Poland is, for example, doing pretty well and mastering the economic crisis. It's not all East European countries which are in bad shape. The Czech Republic is also in rather good shape. Obviously, they have a very Eurosceptical president, Václav Klaus, but still, I mean, the country is functioning. Economically, I think Slovakia is pretty well off. Yes, they will have elections in March. We will see the outcome. Hungary is a special case, and it has also a lot to do with the previous government, with the socialist government and all the errors and the corruption scandals that they had. Because at the moment, it seems like there is no opposition in Hungary. We have Fidesz, and then we have the extreme right, and then some little opposition parties, the socialists and the Greens, which cannot agree to form a coalition. So the problem is the lack of the political alternative.
Kaj Lang, Romania, Slovakia, disturbing signs there at any rate as well. Should we be concerned about Eastern Europe as a whole?
I think there's, of course, a broader tendency in the European Union towards so-called populist parties, but I would agree completely to Edith Inotai that Hungary is a quite particular case. If you look at the region, in spite of the economic hardships we have in some countries, in political terms, they're quite stable. Look at Latvia. They were hit really hard by the economic and financial crisis. They did an austerity program which was quite close to what the Greeks have going to do, and the Dombrovskis government basically was re-elected. In the last elections, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, the moderate fiscal conservative parties won the elections. Jarosław Kaczynski lost the elections. In the Czech Republic and Slovakia, conservative liberal parties who said we have to do cuts, otherwise we'll have a second Greece here, they won the elections. Before the election, the campaign, they had a fiscal conservative platform, which is quite rare, and they won the election. So I think it's indeed the case that in Hungary we had the combination of the two main drivers of populists in Central Eastern Europe, economic deterioration and a high level of corruption. Yeah. And that was what gave Viktor Orban the two-thirds majority.
And it's also interesting when you compare to other East European countries, we don't have a liberal conservative party.
So, Eric Kirschbaum, is there reason to hope, if we look at some of those other examples, that the problems in Hungary may simply blow over, that the democratic system may correct itself within Hungary, or?
No, it's pretty scary. The signals coming from Hungary are scary. It seems like this party won a two-thirds majority, and they're doing all they can to make sure they don't lose another election. And Europe is upset about it, especially Germany. As you mentioned, Germany had its own past experience with a dictatorship that built like that, and we've heard this word dictatorship already for Orban, and it's scary. And I think the focus is going to be on Hungary. The other countries in Eastern Europe are having their problems, but the problems in Hungary are special, and I don't think the focus is going to go away. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward with Orban, and he makes the strategic retreats, but people aren't going to let up. I don't think the EU is going to let up.
It seems that there's a bit of a paradox here. We heard from Eric Kirschbaum before that Hungary desperately needs support and help from the IMF and the EU. And yet, on the other hand, we have Viktor Orban saying, we can go it alone, we don't need anybody, nationalism.
That's rhetoric, of course. He's very strong in rhetoric, and he's talking to his sympathizers. I mean, he launched a so-called war against the IMF last year. It's very difficult to get back from this rhetoric. He will eventually do that. Right now, I mean, there is a minister just named just to talk to the IMF, because the economic minister is not very welcome by the IMF anymore. So there is a new person just to do those talks, which are necessary. So I think the government knows that, and Viktor Orban knows that. He has to change perhaps a little bit his rhetoric, but he thinks he can get away with that.
Kaj Lang, what potential do you see within Hungary for a corrective coming from within the country, the system?
Yeah, Viktor Orban's strength is also the opposition's weakness. And of course, he has lost support quite substantially. But if you look at the opinion polls, people who are fed up with Orban go to the non-voters. And the only party which has benefited for the time being was Jobbik, the far right. With the new electoral law, which is based on the British system, which means the relatively strongest party will benefit over proportionally. With the new electoral law, there is no real alternative to Orban and his Fidesz without a united opposition. And this is a big problem.
So, Eric Hirschbaum, in a word, what should the EU do?
Just stay on the ball and keep the pressure on.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thank you to you out there for tuning in. Bye-bye.